Sometimes we look for solutions to our problems in the most unusual places. We might seek out a new technique to manage pain or a quick way to solve a financial problem. We do it because we think it's going to make our lives better, easier. But what happens when that so-called solution, the very thing that's supposed to help you, ends up being the worst thing that could ever happen? What if that fix, that shortcut, leads directly to a tragic end? Today, we have two stories about people who found solutions to their problems, but these solutions came with a cost that no one could have ever predicted. On the 15th of March 2011, just after 1 in the afternoon, 16-year-old Marcus Freeman was behind the wheel of his dad's pickup truck. He was driving down a highway in Northport, Florida, with his girlfriend Carly beside him. A song he loved came on the radio, and he started belting out the lyrics, and Carly joined right in with him. They had just come from the dentist's office where Marcus had gotten some dental work done. His jaw was really starting to ache, a deep, throbbing pain that was hard to ignore. The singing was mostly a way to distract himself from it, and for a little while, it was working. But every time a song would end and a commercial would come on, the pain would rush back, and it was all he could think about. But Marcus wasn't your typical 16-year-old. He was used to dealing with discomfort, both physical and mental. He had been working really hard to become the kind of person who could push through pain. He was the starting quarterback for the varsity football team at Northport High, and that came with a lot of pressure. Over the past year, he had gotten serious about his physical fitness. He was doing these incredibly difficult, vomit-inducing workouts to get stronger and faster. He knew that physical toughness was part of the game. And then there was the mental side of things. Being the quarterback, all eyes were on him. The nerves before a big game could be overwhelming. He felt a general level of anxiety that a lot of high performers feel. So, he had started working with a school counselor to develop techniques to manage those nerves, to stay calm under pressure. So, dealing with pain, whether it was the ache in his muscles after a workout or the anxiety in his chest before a game, was something Marcus was actively working on. He was a very forward-leaning kid, always trying to improve himself. And all of this hard work seemed to be paying off in a big way. The Northport High football team, which had been terrible for years, was now coming off one of their best seasons ever, and a lot of that was because of Marcus's leadership on the field. But it wasn't just the football team that was on an upswing. The entire school seemed to be transforming. For a long time, Northport High had a bad reputation. The sports teams were bad, graduation rates were low, and test scores were in the basement. It just wasn't a great place to be. But now, it felt like Leaning Corn had totally turned a corner. It wasn't just football. Other sports programs were improving too. Student grades and test scores were going up across the board. And maybe most importantly, the students just seemed happier. There was a better energy in the hallways. It wasn't just Marcus who was thriving, it felt like everyone was. And if you asked anyone at Northport High why this was happening, they would all give you the same answer. There was one person to thank for this incredible turnaround, their principal, George Kenny. Mr. Kenny had been the principal for about a decade, but in the last few years, he had really changed things up. He introduced new ideas to the curriculum and put a huge new focus on providing individual support for every student. He wanted each kid to feel seen and heard and helped. And the results seemed to speak for themselves. The whole school was flourishing under his leadership. But right now, as Marcus drove down that highway, none of that was on his mind. The only thing he could think about was the searing pain in his jaw. It felt like it was getting worse with every passing second. It was no longer just an ache, it was a sharp, throbbing pulse that was starting to make him feel dizzy. But Marcus had been working on pain management. He had his techniques, the same ones he used to push through exhaustion on the football field or to calm his nerves before a big play. He was going to use those techniques now. As Carly sat next to him, he took a slow, deep breath and tried to relax his body. He tried to just breathe and let his mind go somewhere else, anywhere else but the pain. This was literally what his counselor had taught him. He would do this mental exercise where he would let his mind drift away from the physical discomfort, focusing on something else entirely. It was almost like a form of meditation, and it usually worked for him. He could find a way to push through. But this time was different. It just wasn't working. The pain in his jaw just kept hammering away, and he couldn't get it out of his head. Soon, it felt like the pain was growing, radiating up from his jaw, across his cheek, and into his entire head. It was becoming completely overwhelming. But he stayed focused. He kept trying to separate his mind from the pain. And then, all of a sudden, the throbbing stopped. Just like that, it was gone. And Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. While Marcus was going through this intense internal battle, Carly was in the passenger seat fiddling with the radio dial. She was trying to find another good song they could sing along to. Carly loved spending time with Marcus. She liked him so much that she had just tagged along to his dentist appointment just so they could hang out a little longer. She thought he was incredibly kind and funny. When she was with him, they could talk and laugh for hours, and it would feel like only a minute had passed. But as she was searching for a new station, she realized Marcus had gone completely silent. It was unusual for him. She looked over at him, and what she saw made her gasp. Marcus seemed to have gone totally rigid. His arms were locked straight out in front of him, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were turning white. His head was tilted back slightly, and his eyes were starting to roll back into his head. He was staring up at the ceiling of the truck, not at the road. Carly started screaming his name, trying to snap him out of it. "Marcus! Marcus, what are you doing?" she yelled, clapping her hands and shaking his shoulder. But he didn't answer. He didn't even seem to hear her. He just stayed in that bizarre, stiff state while the truck continued to speed down the highway at nearly 100 miles an hour. Panic set in. Carly was screaming, grabbing at his arm, trying to get him to look at her, to move, to do anything. But it was like he wasn't there anymore. It was like he was gone. Then Carly turned her head and looked through the windshield. Her scream turned into one of pure terror as she saw the truck was veering off the road, heading straight for a large tree on the shoulder. The impact was instant. And for Carly, everything went black. A few hours later, Carly's eyes slowly opened. Her entire body ached, and her head was pounding with a dull, heavy rhythm. At first, she had no idea where she was. Then she heard the steady beeping of machines next to her. She looked around the room. It was stark white. She realized she was in a hospital. And as soon as she made that connection, the entire horrible memory came flooding back. She remembered Marcus, the strange way he looked, stiff and unresponsive at the wheel. She remembered the crash, the sound of metal hitting the tree. As she was trying to process it all, a nurse came into the room. Carly's first words were about Marcus. "Where is Marcus?" she asked. "Is he okay? Can I see him?" The nurse had a very gentle, sad look on her face. And that's when Carly learned the devastating truth. Marcus was dead. Almost a month passed. It was April 8th, and Carly was back at Northport High School, sitting in her Spanish class. She was trying her best to focus on the teacher's lesson, but concentration was something that just didn't come easily to her anymore. Physically, her injuries from the crash had healed, but emotionally, she was still in pieces. Marcus's death had completely shattered her world. But maybe the hardest part of it all was that there was no explanation for what had happened. Why had he been acting that way right before they crashed? What had happened to him in that truck? It was a huge, unanswered question that hung over everyone. The official story in the media was that Marcus had simply lost control of his vehicle. But Carly knew that wasn't right. She was there. She saw what happened. Marcus went into some kind of trance, and it was that frozen, rigid state that caused the truck to veer off the road at 100 miles an hour. There was no bad weather that day. There were no obstacles on the road. Whatever caused Marcus to freeze up was what caused the crash. But nobody was talking about that part. It felt like nobody even understood it. Of course, there were theories floating around, especially at school. A lot of students thought that maybe Marcus had received some kind of sedative at the dentist and had a delayed bad reaction to it while he was driving. Others wondered if he had just had some sort of random, sudden medical event, like a seizure or a stroke. But when the results of his autopsy were released, it put those theories to rest. There was no trace of any drugs in his system, and there was no indication that he had suffered a stroke, a seizure, or an aneurysm. So, those explanations were ruled out. Because the crash was considered a tragic accident and not a case of foul play, the police weren't investigating it any further. They had been at the scene, they had documented what happened, but there was no deeper investigation to find out why it happened. For Carly, this was a difficult reality to accept. She knew it was possible that she, and everyone else who loved Marcus, might never get the answers they were so desperate for. It might just remain a mystery forever. And it was so hard to go back to normal life, to sit in class and pretend to be a regular kid again, when there was this giant hole in her life that felt like it would never be filled. But Carly wasn't the only one grieving. Marcus had been an incredibly popular and well-loved student at Northport High. After their principal, Mr. Kenny, had announced his death to the student body, there was an outpouring of grief. There were memorial services and student gatherings. Mr. Kenny made sure that grief counselors were brought into the school to help students process the terrible loss. And so, as Carly sat there in her Spanish class trying to listen, the school's announcement system crackled to life. It was Mr. Kenny's voice. He said he had something to tell them. Carly could tell immediately from his tone that it wasn't going to be good news. Normally, Mr. Kenny was an upbeat, enthusiastic person. His voice was usually full of energy. But right now, it sounded solemn, and there was a slight tremor in it as he spoke. He started to say something, then he stopped himself and cleared his throat. And then he just said it. Another Northport student has just died. In the weeks that followed that awful announcement, Carly tried to make sense of how it was even possible. 2 students from their school had died in less than 2 months. This second death was different from Marcus's. It was self-inflicted. But still, Northport was a small, tight-knit school. This was not a place where young people just suddenly started dying. It just didn't happen. But then, just a few weeks after that, in early May, Carly's confusion turned into complete and utter disbelief. Another Northport student died. This death was also self-inflicted. The news sent Carly and the rest of the already fragile student body into a state of shock. 2 deaths so close together had been hard enough to process, but 3 was just unthinkable. A dark cloud seemed to settle over the entire school. It felt like the entire student body was on edge, almost bracing for more bad news, as if more death was just inevitable. One night, not long after the 3rd death, Carly was at home in her room, scrolling through Facebook on her computer. She came across a post from one of her classmates. It was a short post, but when she read it, she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of it herself. The post pointed out that all 3 of the recent deaths had one very specific thing in common. So many people at Northport High, from students to staff to parents, believed that the school's recent incredible improvements were all because of their principal, Mr. Kenny. He was known for being very student-focused, for giving kids a lot of individual attention to help them succeed. But Mr. Kenny also had a secret. For the past 3 years, Mr. Kenny had been holding private meetings with students and staff members to help them with their personal issues. Things like anxiety, pain management, mental health struggles, trouble concentrating, or improving test scores. He was working with them one-on-one to help them become the best versions of themselves. And to do this, he was putting them under hypnosis. Mr. Kenny would invite students, sometimes as many as 2 a day, into his office for these private recorded hypnosis sessions. He did the same thing for teachers who were struggling. He even sometimes brought entire sports teams into his office and would hypnotize them all together before big games to help them improve their performance. But there was a critical detail here. Mr. Kenny didn't just perform the hypnosis himself. He also taught the students how to do it on their own, how to perform self-hypnosis. The problem was, Mr. Kenny had only ever taken a very brief course in hypnosis. He had no license to be using it as a therapeutic tool to diagnose or resolve actual mental or physical health issues. He was not qualified or licensed to be doing this. But for a while, it seemed to be working. A lot of kids responded really well to his sessions. They reported feeling less anxious, more focused. Some of the athletes started excelling in their sports like never before. But along with these positive results, there were also some very alarming side effects. Some parents at Northport reported that their children started having strange personality changes after they began hypnosis sessions with Mr. Kenny. They said their kids would sometimes just get these blank stares on their faces. Others said that after a session, their child would seem disoriented, or they would start doing things they would never normally do. Some even began talking about hurting themselves. And so, after the third student death, that Facebook post that Carly saw had revealed the one thing that connected all three tragedies. All three of the students who had died had been repeatedly hypnotized by Mr. Kenny. Now, Mr. Kenny swore that he was not responsible for their deaths. But he was ultimately charged with practicing therapeutic hypnosis without a license, and he received a year of probation. The Sarasota County School Board also paid a total of $600,000 to the families of the three victims. As for Mr. Kenny, he has since retired from teaching. The solution he offered his students, a way to manage their pain and anxiety, had become an unimaginable tragedy. While that principal's solution led to disaster, in our next story, a man's own solution to his problems would bring him face to face with a consequence he never, ever saw coming. Shortly after 8 o'clock at night on the 9th of October, 1996, a 31-year-old man named Anthony Irvin was walking down a dark sidewalk in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was heading towards a local grocery store. It wasn't freezing out, but there was a chilly wind blowing and it was pretty dark. Anthony only had a light jacket on, and he was starting to feel uncomfortable. He pulled the thin jacket tighter around himself as he walked. All he wanted to do was go home where it was warm. But he couldn't do that. Not yet. First, he needed money. Once he had money, then he could go home. Anthony had lived a pretty rough life. For the most part, he was a career criminal. He hadn't held down a regular job in a very long time. Instead, whenever he needed cash, like he did tonight, he would either steal from a local business or he would mug someone on the street. Over the past 9 years, he had been arrested 8 separate times for crimes like robbery and assault. To the people in his neighborhood, he was mostly just a huge nuisance. Even if some of them felt sorry for his situation, he was still a problem. But despite how often he committed these crimes, they were always relatively petty. So, he never served very much time in prison. He always ended up right back out on the street, and he always ended up right back to his old ways. But tonight, as Anthony walked down that empty road, he wasn't thinking about how his actions affected his neighbors. He was just thinking about finding a place or a person to rob. And tonight, he decided he was going to look for a person. He needed a target. As he walked, he actually started to get a little worried. The street seemed quieter than usual. There was almost nobody out. He started to think that if he didn't find someone soon, he was going to be out of luck for the night. No money. But just then, he saw someone up ahead. A young man turned the corner and started walking up the sidewalk, right in Anthony's direction. He looked like a smaller guy, younger, and he was all by himself. And right away, Anthony thought, perfect. This is my mark. I'm going to rob this guy. So Anthony started walking towards this unsuspecting young man. As he got closer, he had a sudden realization. He knew this person. It was his neighbor, Harry. And Anthony thought to himself, oh, this is even more perfect, because he knew Harry. He knew that Harry was super soft-spoken and gentle. He was a calm person. He's not going to put up a fight. He's going to be so easy to rob. Sure, it was a terrible thing to do, to rob your own neighbor. Harry would know it was him. But Anthony figured, what's he going to do about it? So Anthony marched right up to Harry and stopped directly in front of him, completely blocking his path on the sidewalk. And then Anthony delivered his classic, time-tested mugging threat. A few minutes later, a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department named Perry Kelly was driving his cruiser fast down a city street. He had gotten a call about a mugging in progress, and he was hoping he could get there in time to catch the person responsible or at least get a look at them before they got away. So Kelly turned a corner and pulled up in front of the address he'd been given. As his headlights swept across the sidewalk, he saw two men. One of them was lying motionless on the ground. The other one was sitting right on top of him. And Detective Kelly's first thought was, perfect. I got him. He assumed the man on top was the mugger. He had caught him in the act. He was about to jump out of his car and make an arrest. But he was wrong. When Detective Kelly got out of his car and learned what had actually happened there, it would turn out to be the single strangest thing he had ever encountered in his entire 25-year career. So, when Anthony mugged people, he had a specific method he always used. He would put his hand deep into his coat pocket and press his fingers forward, making it look like he was holding a gun inside the pocket. He would aim his hand towards his target and say something like, "Hey, I got a gun. Give me all your money or I'm going to shoot you." And it usually worked. People would look down, they'd see the bulge in his jacket that they thought was a gun, and rather than risk it, they'd just hand over their wallets. It wasn't worth finding out if the gun was real or not. Anthony would grab the money and take off. He was thinking that this exact trick would work perfectly on Harry. This meek young kid would be an easy score. So he walks up to Harry, stands in front of him, and blocks his way. Harry, who hadn't seen him coming, actually bumps into him and seems confused. And that's when Anthony delivers the line. His hand is in his pocket, pretending it's a gun. "Hand over all your money or I'm going to shoot." But Harry, whether he believed Anthony had a gun or not, had no way of seeing it to confirm. Because Harry was blind. And Anthony knew Harry was blind. They were neighbors. In Anthony's mind, that's what made him such a perfect victim. He was going to rob the small blind kid from down the street. That was his plan. But what Anthony didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that in addition to being blind, Harry also happened to be a karate master and a master wrestler as well. So when Harry was suddenly confronted by a man telling him he was about to be shot, his self-defense instincts took over instantly. He grabbed Anthony, flipped him completely over his shoulder, and slammed him hard into the concrete ground. The impact broke Anthony's neck, and he was killed instantly. And then Harry simply sat on top of his body and waited for the police to arrive. Harry was never charged with any crime in connection with Anthony's death. It was clearly determined that he had acted in self-defense. And even though the media at the time called him a hero for what he did, Harry himself felt terrible that he had killed Anthony. He never meant for that to happen. He was just protecting himself. He later called the whole thing a tragedy. It leaves you wondering how many other solutions are out there just waiting to become someone's greatest tragedy. But after hearing these stories, you will wonder, how many times do we often trust something just because it is said to help us? And how do we know when a solution has quietly crossed the line into something dangerous? Currently, we are constantly seeking quicker solutions for stress, pain, and pressure. The real question is whether we are solving our problems or just handing them over to things we don't fully understand. Thank you so much for watching. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick was sitting on the floor of a vacant studio apartment. He was in a somewhat run-down apartment building where he both lived and worked, located in a coastal town in northern England called Satan Carew. The building itself was called The Cliff, and it was perched right across the street from the ocean, offering a wide, gray view of the water. Carl was in the middle of a job, painting the apartment to get it ready for a new tenant, but he'd taken a break. He had his lunch spread out on a dust sheet beside him and was deep into one of his favorite spy novels. Carl was a huge fan of spy stories. He had a small collection of books that he would just read over and over again, finding something new in them each time. But as he was about to turn a page, a movement outside the window pulled his attention away from the book. He looked out and saw his landlady, a woman named Anne Darwin. She lived in a large Victorian house right next door to the apartment building. At that moment, she was standing in front of her house, but she wasn't alone. She was with her two adult sons, Anthony and Mark. What struck Carl immediately was that all three of them were dressed entirely in black, and each one was holding a wreath made of flowers. Feeling a bit like one of the spies from his novels, Carl stayed low and watched from the window. He saw the family of three walk across the street together, moving towards a grassy knoll that overlooked the sea. From his vantage point, he watched as Anne and her sons stood there for a moment, then bowed their heads. He could tell they were likely praying or sharing a moment of quiet remembrance. Then, one by one, all three of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean, watching as the waves carried them away. Carl knew exactly what this was about. They were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin. 2 years earlier, John had died in a tragic kayaking accident right there in the waters just in front of their house. As Carl watched, he could see Anne's shoulders shaking. It was clear she was crying, and seeing her grief made him feel a pang of sadness himself. Carl cared deeply for Anne. Their relationship was complicated. He wasn't just her handyman and tenant, they had been secretly and romantically involved for almost 2 years, ever since he had first moved into the cliff. But Carl's connection to Anne went back much further than that. He had known her for most of his life, and, if he was being honest with himself, he had been in love with her for decades. Both Carl and Anne had grown up in a town near Satan, Carew. The very first time Carl ever saw her was on the school bus back in high school. He had been completely captivated by her, but was too shy to ever work up the courage to say hello. Soon after, he left for college, but the memory of her never really faded. After finishing his education, Carl went on to build a life of his own. He became a school teacher and started a family. But his life took a sharp downturn after he made a series of really bad real estate investments. His financial troubles spiraled into legal troubles, and eventually, it all fell apart. He ended up leaving his family and going on the run from the police. He found himself living in the woods just outside of Satan, Carew, a shadow of the man he once was. And that's when fate, or something like it, brought him and Anne back into each other's lives. One evening, he was near his campsite when he saw a car pull into a nearby parking lot. He recognized Anne at the wheel, and she looked incredibly upset. This time, all these years later, he decided to approach her. He walked over to her car and gently knocked on the window. It turned out that her husband's kayaking accident had happened only a few weeks before. She was emotionally shattered and completely overwhelmed. On top of her grief, she was also desperate for help managing the properties she and her husband had owned together. That very same night, she offered him a place to stay. She let him move into one of the empty apartments at the cliff. And once Carl was settled in, their relationship slowly blossomed into a quiet, unconventional romance. His days were spent working, fixing up the apartments in the building. His nights were spent with Anne in her house next door. Keeping their relationship a secret was strange for both of them, but they each had their reasons. Carl was terrified of being arrested. He was still a wanted man, so if anyone knew his true identity or where he was, it would all be over. For Anne, the situation was different. She felt that her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow, possibly for the rest of her life. She was worried about what people would think if it looked like she had moved on so quickly after her husband's death. Their shared dream was that at some point, Anne could sell her properties. They would take the money, move far away together, and start a completely new life. But they both knew it was a long shot. The biggest hurdle was Carl. He would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without a valid passport and without getting arrested. Back in the apartment, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street and into their house. He sighed, picked up his spy novel, and went back to reading. But he wasn't just reading for pleasure anymore. As he followed the story's plot and the actions of the main character, he was making mental notes. He was actively searching for inspiration, for a clever trick or a loophole he could use. Carl was working on a grand plan, a plan that he hoped would finally allow him and Anne to escape and start their new life together. He was using these spy novels as his textbooks. A small smile crept onto his face as he thought about how brilliant his scheme was. He even imagined that someday in the future, an author might write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 long years for Carl to finalize every detail of his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready. He walked through the airport near Satan Karu, trying his best to look casual and blend in with the other travelers. He approached the ticketing counter, his heart pounding in his chest. He handed his passport to the gate agent, then glanced over his shoulder. He saw Anne standing at the back of the line. Their eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away. They had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other, just in case something went wrong. When Carl turned back, he saw the ticketing agent staring intently at his passport. His heart rate kicked up another notch. This was the moment of truth. The passport he was using was a fake. He had meticulously created a whole new identity for himself. He had used the birth and death records of a baby who had been born in the same year as him but had died in infancy. It was an idea he'd lifted directly from one of his favorite spy novels, The Day of the Jackal, which was about an assassin who constantly changed identities. If this worked, if this agent bought the fake passport, he and Anne would be on a flight to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was to stay there permanently. He hoped that Anne would fall in love with the place and eventually move there to be with him. He had read a travel brochure on Panama that described it as a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases. That description made him feel like he would fit right in. Plus, the cost of living was incredibly low compared to the UK, and it was thousands of miles away from anyone who might recognize him. It seemed like the perfect place for them to disappear. But everything hinged on this one moment. It all depended on his fake passport being convincing enough to get past this agent. After what felt like an eternity, the agent looked up from the passport, smiled, and handed it back to Carl along with his boarding pass. Carl had to physically restrain himself from letting out a huge sigh of relief. Instead, he just gave a casual thank you to the agent. As he walked away from the counter, he turned back one more time and gave a subtle wink to Anne, who was still waiting in line. After decades of just reading about international spies, Carl felt like he had finally become one. And, he had to admit, he liked the feeling a lot. Soon, he would be living full-time as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep. A real estate agent was driving them through the lush Panamanian countryside. They sped along a highway that cut through the jungle, and with every mile, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a sharp bend in the road, and suddenly, the dense jungle gave way to a stunning, sandy beach. The realtor pulled the car over and told them to get out, to take a look around and see if this particular plot of land felt like it could be their new home. Carl had done the math 100 times. Once Anne sold the apartment building and combined that money with the life insurance payout she had received after her husband's death, they would have around £600,000 in savings. That was roughly 800,000 American dollars. It was more than enough to get them set up, but they would need a steady source of income in Panama as well. That's where this land came in. Carl's big idea was to buy this piece of jungle paradise and open an eco-lodge resort. These types of resorts were becoming incredibly popular in Central America. Tourists would pay good money to stay in rustic beachside cabins for a week, go canoeing, horseback riding, and trekking through the jungle. Carl also planned to build a private villa on the property just for him and Anne, right there on the beach. He led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed across the bay to the tree line. He told her to imagine a row of beautiful cabins nestled among the trees. He described a long dock stretching out into the water, with a bunch of canoes tied up to it. He talked about a path that would lead from the cabins to a horse stable hidden in the woods. Then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to picture a magnificent seaside villa, their home, where the two of them would live out their days. Anne kicked off her sandals and waded into the warm water. Carl could see it in her eyes. She was picturing it, imagining the life they could have here. For Carl, it felt like years of meticulous, risky planning were finally about to pay off. This trip had been the best week of his entire relationship with Anne. For the first time, they could act like a normal couple. They went out to dinner in public every night. They walked down the street holding hands without fear. Carl loved being John Jones. He felt a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in a very long time. And oddly enough, even though his identity was a complete fabrication, he felt more like his old self, the person he was before all the debt and the legal problems had crushed him. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne was completely sold on the idea. She told Carl that she was taken with Panama and that yes, she wanted to move here with him. She promised that as soon as she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and prepare for the big move. Carl was beaming. Their realtor, sensing the happy moment, grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the day they decided to change their lives forever. It took another full year for Anne to sort everything out back home. She had to sell her properties in Satan, Carew, and, even more difficult, she had to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They were all shocked at first. It seemed like such a random and drastic decision, but eventually they came to understand. They believed she needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life with John. Shortly after Anne sold the last of the properties, Carl used some of their funds to buy a condominium in Panama City. It would be a place for them to live while they were building their dream resort. And then, finally, on the 22nd of October 2007, Anne moved to Panama for good. That night, Carl picked her up from the airport and drove her to their new home. As he drove, he had to force a smile. He had recently discovered some news, some terrible news, that was going to throw their entire new life into jeopardy. He gave Anne a quick tour of their penthouse apartment, then asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. Anne immediately sensed that something was wrong. Her expression shifted from excitement to worry. Carl took a deep breath. He told Anne how excited he was to build their resort together, but then he dropped the bomb. There was one last, unexpected obstacle standing in their way. He explained that he had only learned about it a few weeks ago and had been waiting for the right moment to tell her in person. He had discovered that the Panamanian government had recently instituted new procedures for anyone moving to the country. All new residents, including English citizens, now needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police. This was to prove they had no criminal record. For Anne, this was no problem at all. But for Carl, it was a catastrophe. He was living in Panama as John Jones. If the authorities looked into his identity, they would very quickly discover that John Jones didn't really exist. Anne put her head in her hands and whispered, "What are we going to do?" Carl admitted that he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised her that he would figure something out. He always did. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne along a busy street in Panama City. They window shopped, but Carl's mind was racing. He was trying to think of any possible way he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in Panama illegally. He was done with hiding. The whole point of coming here was so that he and Anne could finally live their lives together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop where she was looking at furniture for their new apartment. As he wandered aimlessly around the store, he came across a bookshelf filled with old books. He saw a few spy novels among them. All the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't read them, but he picked one up anyway. He began flipping through the pages, just hoping for some kind of spark, some kind of inspiration. And as he stood there, an idea did come to him. But it wasn't inspired by the book in his hands. He suddenly remembered the plot of a different spy novel, one he had read more than a decade ago. At the time he read it, he had thought the central plot was absolutely insane, far too crazy to ever work in real life. But now, as he and Anne walked around the city that afternoon, he kept coming back to that idea. He started to turn it over in his mind, seeing how he might just be able to adapt it to his own situation. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was incredibly risky, maybe the riskiest thing they had ever attempted. But he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, the 2nd of December 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom. He was wandering around the West End of London, doing his best to look utterly lost and confused. He walked through streets decorated with festive Christmas displays, looking around with a vacant expression until a concerned store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. Carl gave her a shy, hesitant smile and asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" When she told him it was because it was December, he pretended to be baffled, as if he had no idea what month or even what year it was. He claimed he didn't know where he was. He then asked the clerk for help. Just as he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern. She took him by the arm and escorted him to the nearest police station. Inside, she explained to the officer at the front desk that something was seriously wrong with this man. The officer smiled kindly at Carl and asked him what the problem was. Carl knew that what he did next had to be an award-winning acting performance. The success of his entire plan depended on it. He scratched at his head, looked at the officer with pleading eyes, and said that he thought he had lost his whole family. The officer's demeanor immediately became more serious. He sat up straighter and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Carl had come to a realization. The only way he could ever truly feel like his old self again in Panama was to actually become his old self. He needed to reclaim the identity he had left behind. But to do that without also reclaiming all his old debt and his outstanding legal problems, it was going to require one more colossal lie. Carl looked the police officer in the eye and explained that he knew his name, but that was it. He claimed he couldn't remember anything else about himself because, he said, he had amnesia. The officer just stared at him, obviously dumbfounded. He then turned and called for his supervisor. From that moment on, things started to move very, very fast, but not at all in the direction that Carl had expected. Carl had believed that by claiming amnesia, he could essentially wipe his slate clean in England. He figured he could resume his old life under his real name, make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial position, and then get a real, legitimate passport. With that, he and Anne could live happily and truly openly in Panama. But that is not what happened. Almost immediately, the newspapers caught wind of his incredible story, and it exploded. It made the front page. To the rest of the world, Carl had a story that was almost unbelievable. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, a man with no memory of his past, no knowledge of his own identity. Almost overnight, he became a massive international news sensation. The entire world wanted to know, where had this man been for the past few years? Carl had not anticipated any of this publicity. He and Anne were both horrified. Their horror turned to pure panic when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph they had found on an obscure real estate website in Panama. In the picture, Carl could be seen standing next to Anne and their realtor. All three of them were beaming with happiness after a successful day of viewing properties. This photograph was very, very bad for Carl. It was irrefutable proof that he had not been wandering around the UK homeless with amnesia, just as he had told the police. But the photo was even worse for Anne. It was devastating, because it proved something far more shocking, far more terrible than simple financial fraud. This one picture unraveled a story so outlandish that it sounded like it must have come directly from the pages of a fictional spy novel. It would turn out that Anne was not the grieving widow she had pretended to be for years. And her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick at all. Carl's real name, the one he had given to that police officer in London when he was faking amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's supposedly dead husband. The two of them had faked his death in that kayaking accident all those years ago. It was an elaborate scheme to escape his crippling debt and so that they could fraudulently claim his life insurance money. Not even their own sons knew their father was still alive. For years, they had grieved for a man who was secretly living right next door. Only Anne and, of course, John were in on the secret. John and Anne were both quickly arrested for fraud. They ended up serving more than 3 years in prison. In a strange way, John's very unhappy ending mirrors the ending of the very book he used for inspiration, The Day of the Jackal. In that novel, the assassin pulls off a series of impressive feats to change his identity and evade capture, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on the 9th of October 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Bologasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station. This station was located on a remote, frozen island in Antarctica. The common room served as the general multipurpose hangout area for the station's crew. Oleg was sitting there watching television while his coworker, a man named Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, quietly reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for a while. When they weren't on duty, there really wasn't much else to do in that isolated place besides sit around and drink. Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months at this point. He was part of a 14-person crew on a year-round research mission. Their job was to observe the island's ocean and weather patterns, collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg's primary responsibility was maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which kept him busy for a good portion of the day. But there was still a significant amount of downtime, and Oleg spent almost all of it inside. Being outside in Antarctica was generally a very bad idea. The landscape was riddled with hundreds of lethal, deep ice crevasses, many of them barely visible under the snow. If you fell into one, you were dead. The fall itself could kill you, or you would simply be trapped and freeze. On top of that, there were the obviously freezing temperatures and the constant threat of violent, lethal blizzards. It was a place that was fundamentally not built for human beings. So, Oleg and his coworkers only ever went outside when their work absolutely required it. Otherwise, they were confined to the station's buildings. And inside, their entertainment options were severely limited. There was a television that only got 2 channels. There was a small gym. There was a nearby church. And there was a library. By this point in his tour, Oleg was sick of all of it. He was even tired of the library, which was a shame because he loved to read. But the library was tiny, and he had already read almost every single book on its shelves. His colleague, Sergei, who was sitting near him, also loved to read. Books were one of the few things the two men actually spent a lot of time talking about. Since Oleg couldn't find anything interesting to watch on the 2-channel TV and was feeling intensely bored and stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergei was in the mood for one of their deep, literary conversations. Oleg turned off the TV, tossed the remote onto a chair, and took a long swig of his drink. He glanced over to the corner where Sergei was absorbed in his book. He saw the cover. It was the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read it. The book is about a depressed man suffering from insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts a secret club where people just literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had one of the most epic plot twists he had ever read. So, Oleg got up and walked over to Sergei. He asked him what he thought of the book so far. But Sergei just grunted and kept reading, effectively ignoring him. Oleg wasn't surprised by this. He knew Sergei very well. The two of them had worked closely together on various research projects over the years. He knew that Sergei was a generally quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved to get into long, passionate discussions about everything and anything. Sometimes, Oleg could coax Sergei out of his shell by asking a lot of questions or telling jokes. But today did not seem to be one of those days. This was frustrating for Oleg, but he could take a hint. He could tell that Sergei just wanted to be left alone to read. So, he stood up and left the common room to go find something else to do. Oleg spent the next few hours just wandering around the station, checking some of the research logs, and continuing to sip his drink. He briefly thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air. But when he checked the outdoor temperature, he saw that it was well below freezing. He decided against it. So, after 3 hours of trying and failing to kill time, Oleg finally gave up and headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 in the afternoon when Oleg stepped into the dining room. He was feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he had been drinking all day. And the first person he saw when he got inside was Sergey. He was sitting at a table, still reading Fight Club, just as he had been doing hours earlier in the common room. Oleg got himself some food and then went over to sit with Sergey. He figured he'd try again and see if maybe now he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, he was. When Oleg sat down, Sergey actually put his book down on the table and looked up, ready to talk. It was possible that he had also had a lot to drink by this point and was feeling a bit more sociable. So the two men began to discuss the book Fight Club. Very quickly, their conversation became really energetic. They were both a bit drunk and were getting excited about the points they were making. Then, Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic and insightful point about the book and its deeper meaning. To Oleg, it seemed like the conversation was going great. But then, all of a sudden, right after he made his point, Oleg noticed that Sergey had gone completely silent. His face had changed. Oleg, who could read Sergey very well by now, knew what this meant. Sergey was done talking. He wanted some space again. Oleg glanced down at his watch. He realized he actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over. He was about to look up and tell Sergey that he was going to go leave to check on one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergey was gone. He had vanished from the table. And at that exact same moment, a wild, agonized scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building at the station, the research station's manager was in his office, going through some paperwork. Suddenly, his office door flew open with a bang. The manager looked up and saw one of his employees standing in the doorway, looking absolutely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide, and his breath was coming in ragged gasps, like he was in a state of shock. When the employee managed to explain why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the man not to move. He then grabbed his heavy coat and flew out the door, into the brutal, freezing cold. The manager struggled to pull on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground, heading for the building that housed the cafeteria. The whole way there, he felt his own panic growing and growing. Because what that employee had just told him was something that had never, ever happened at their research station before. In fact, he wasn't even sure if it had ever happened on the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally reached the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside. What he saw made him feel immediately sick to his stomach. It would turn out that Oleg and Sergey had been coworkers for a very long time. And because they knew each other so well, Oleg had learned over the years what specific things really truly annoyed Sergey. And Oleg, it seems, used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergey was by violating a very serious, unspoken rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Every single time Sergey would start reading a new book, Oleg would wait until he was about halfway through, and then he would spoil the ending for him. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a pattern. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly and deliberately ruined them for Sergey, which always made Sergey incredibly angry. And that day, in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergey, he didn't just make a great point about the book Fight Club. He told Sergey exactly how it ended. He revealed the big, famous twist. And Sergey, who was very drunk and who, like Oleg, had also been feeling very restless and tense from having been cooped up in that isolated station for months on end, finally snapped. This time, when Oleg spoiled the ending, Sergey completely lost control. He went into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, walked up behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest, all while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Once Sergey had calmed down, He was so shocked and horrified by what he had done that he immediately walked to the manager's office and turned himself in. He was then transported all the way back to Russia and arrested. He was eventually acquitted, however, since he had no previous criminal record. As for Oleg, his heart was severely damaged in the attack, but amazingly, after being evacuated to a hospital, he would survive. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the 20th of June 2004, the dinner rush was in full swing at a seafood restaurant in Orange County, California. In the middle of the chaos, a frantic customer rushed in asking about a takeout order. The manager quickly grabbed the food and brought it to the counter. But as he rang the customer up, he noticed something strange. The customer kept glancing nervously over their shoulder toward the door, their fingers tapping anxiously against the countertop. And the second the transaction was finished, the customer grabbed the food and literally sprinted out of the restaurant. The manager just stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the night. In all his years working there, he had never seen anybody run out of the restaurant like that before. But within seconds, another phone started ringing, another customer stepped up to the counter, and the strange encounter was quickly forgotten. That is, until a few days later when police officers showed up at the restaurant and asked the manager to describe that customer in as much detail as possible. On Monday, the 21st of June 2004, 72-year-old Jane Thompson was driving her car through the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Laguna Niguel, California. She was on her way home from a weekend trip up in Los Angeles, which was about 50 miles north. And for Jane, this drive was always a welcome part of the trip. LA was chaotic, a whirlwind of activity and constant noise. This drive home was her time to be by herself, to let the silence settle in, and to just decompress from the energy of the big city. Jane used to be a part of that world. She had lived in Los Angeles for decades, building a very successful career in the film industry. She had moved to Laguna Niguel about 7 years earlier after she retired, and the move had been a total lifestyle change. Her career in LA had been fast-paced, demanding, and exciting. She had started as an assistant to some very important people in Hollywood, then became an award-winning producer, and later a sought-after decorator for various Hollywood celebrities. It was a glamorous life, filled with parties and premieres and powerful people. And even though Jane was at her core a pretty quiet person who really appreciated her alone time, like she was right now, it had still been a tough transition. It was hard to leave behind the glitz of Hollywood for the slow, relaxed pace of a suburban community. A big part of that difficulty was because her girlfriend, Marion Reese, still lived up in LA. Jane had known Marion for decades. Their story started professionally. Marion owned a production company, and Jane had produced a lot of successful projects for her. They were great colleagues, then they became good friends. And then, at some point years ago, that working friendship blossomed into a full-blown romance. They had been deeply involved ever since. And even though they now lived over an hour's drive apart, they made it work. They saw each other all the time, spending weekends together either in LA or Laguna Niguel. In fact, Jane was already planning to head back to LA again that coming Friday. They had tickets to the opera, which was one of their favorite things to do together. And then, just a week after that, Marion was going to be joining Jane for a long-awaited cruise to Europe. It was going to be the trip of a lifetime for them. But for now, Jane was just enjoying the drive, looking out her window at the familiar scenery. As she passed a cluster of houses, she saw a familiar face. It was her friend, Mary Larkin, out in her front yard tending to her garden. Jane had known Mary for years. Since moving to Laguna Niguel, Mary had become her closest friend in town. They had spent countless nights sitting on one of their patios, talking for hours and sharing a bottle of wine. Sometimes, Mary's next-door neighbor, Karen, would join them, and she had become a close friend to Jane as well. So naturally, Jane slowed her car down, rolled down the window, and called out a friendly hello. She reminded Mary that they were overdue for one of their wine nights, and that they had to have one soon before she left for her big cruise. Mary looked up from her flowers, smiled, and nodded enthusiastically. She promised she would definitely give Jane a call to set something up. After they said their goodbyes, Jane put the car back in drive and continued on her way. A few minutes later, she saw the entrance to her condo complex up ahead. She put on her blinker and turned in. Soon, she was surrounded by rows of mostly identical units with their distinct orange-tiled roofs, all packed closely together on a quiet hillside. Jane absolutely loved her neighborhood. It was peaceful, it was less than 4 miles from the ocean, and she just felt completely safe and comfortable there. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, a place where everyone seemed so warm and welcoming. And that sense of community meant the world to Jane. She didn't have any children or any living relatives. In many ways, she was on her own. So it was a wonderful feeling to know that her neighbors were all looking out for her. As Jane pulled her car into her garage and stepped out, she looked across the street and saw her teenage neighbor, Sam Nelson, shooting baskets in his driveway. Jane smiled and tried to get his attention, raising her hand to wave a simple hello. But when the boy looked over and saw her, his face fell. He immediately put his head down, dropped the basketball, and quickly rushed inside his house, slamming the door behind him. Jane sighed. She understood why he was acting that way. He was clearly deeply embarrassed. You see, Sam was what some people might call a troubled kid. And just this past Friday, while she was out, he had broken into her house and taken some of her jewelry. But Sam wasn't as clever as he thought he was. Jane had a good idea of who was responsible, and it didn't take her long to figure out for sure that it was him. So, before she left for her weekend trip to LA, she had gone over and confronted him about it. She told him she knew what he did and that he was never to do it again. The boy was obviously mortified, completely ashamed of being caught. But Jane had also told Sam something else. She told him she wasn't going to call the police. After all, Sam was only 15 years old. He had just made a really dumb mistake. And in Jane's mind, Sam was a part of her beloved community. And even though he had done something wrong, something that violated her home and her trust, she still wanted to look out for him. Plus, if she was being honest with herself, he hadn't taken anything that was particularly valuable or anything she couldn't live without. So, she felt like she was just giving him a second chance. It wasn't a big deal. At the time, Sam was obviously very appreciative. You could see the relief wash over his face when he realized he wasn't going to get in any real trouble. But it was also clear now that he wanted absolutely nothing to do with Jane. Just the sight of her waving at him was enough to send him running in shame. But for Jane, she figured maybe that was for the best. And so, after watching Sam disappear into his house, she just shrugged, turned around, and headed inside her own home. Jane spent the next few days settling back into her routine. She did her volunteer shift at the local library, she went on long walks with her weekly walking group, and she prepared for her upcoming trips. And before she knew it, it was Thursday evening, June 24th, and it was almost time to head back to LA. That night, the night before she was set to leave, Jane stood in her kitchen making herself a simple pasta dinner. As she stirred the sauce, she thought about what outfit she was going to wear for the opera with Marion the next night. After she ate, she cleaned up her dishes and then settled onto the couch in the living room to watch some television. Her plan was to only watch a little bit, maybe an hour or so, and then get some packing done for her trip. But she was tired from the week, and pretty quickly she felt her eyelids getting heavy. Soon, she was fast asleep right there on her couch. 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Jane's friend and neighbor, Mary Larkin, the woman she had seen in the garden, drove up to Jane's house. Their other friend, Karen Hamara, was in the passenger seat. As they got out of the car, Mary could feel an undeniable knot tightening in her stomach. It was a feeling that had been growing steadily all day, ever since Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, had called her from LA. Marion had sounded panicked. She said that Jane had never shown up in LA for their opera date on Friday, and now she wasn't answering any of her phone calls. Marion had called over and over, but every call went straight to the answering machine. When Mary heard this, she immediately became very worried. It just wasn't like Jane. She was reliable. She was considerate. She would never just flake on people, especially not Marion, without calling to explain why. And given Jane's age, Mary's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenarios. Maybe she had fallen. Maybe she'd had some kind of medical emergency at home and couldn't get to the phone. Maybe she was hurt and needed help. That would explain why nobody could get in touch with her. So after she hung up with Marion, Mary tried calling Jane a few times herself, but she got the same result, the answering machine. With her anxiety growing, Mary had gone over to her neighbor Karen's house and asked her if she would come with her to Jane's condo just to check on her and make sure she was okay. On their short drive over, Mary had tried to convince herself that everything would be fine, that there was a simple explanation for all of this. But now, as she walked up Jane's driveway, that knot in her stomach tightened even more. She could see a few newspapers, still rolled up in their plastic sleeves, piled up at the end of the driveway. That was not a good sign. It meant Jane hadn't been outside to get them for at least a couple of days. So Mary hurried right up the driveway, went to the front door, and started knocking loudly. She and Karen stood there on the porch, listening, but they couldn't hear a single sound coming from inside the house. No television, no movement, nothing. Nobody was coming to the door. Finally, after a few minutes of knocking and calling Jane's name, they gave up on the front door. They left the porch and decided to walk around to the back of the condo to try the back door. And when the two women got into Jane's small, tidy backyard, Mary froze. She could see the sliding glass door that led into Jane's living room. And it was clearly, undeniably, wide open. It wasn't just unlocked, it was slid open several inches. Mary and Karen stood there in the yard and just started yelling through the open door, calling Jane's name over and over, hoping for any kind of response. But all they heard was silence. Eventually, Karen took a hesitant step towards the open door, as if she was going to go inside to look for their friend. But Mary instinctively reached out and grabbed her arm. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking. Mary could barely think straight. Her mind was racing with terrible possibilities. But some gut feeling, some primal instinct, told her that they should not go in there. It just didn't feel safe. And so instead, the two women backed away slowly, left the backyard, and went to go call the police. A few minutes later, Mary and Karen stood out on the street in front of Jane's house, watching as a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The two women immediately went over to the two deputies who got out of the car and tried to explain the situation as calmly as they could. They told them that their friend wasn't answering her phone, that she had missed important plans, and that her back door was wide open, which was just so strange and out of character. They just didn't know what was going on, but they were very, very worried. The officers listened patiently, then asked Mary and Karen to show them this open door. So they all walked around the side of the condo and into the backyard. When they got there, Mary watched as one of the officers walked right up to the open sliding door. He didn't go in. He just stuck his head inside and began to look around. And as soon as he did that, Mary could see his whole body tense up. It was like he had seen something inside that immediately put him on high alert. Mary blurted out, "What is it? What's wrong?" But the officer looking into the home didn't respond to her. Instead, he pulled his head back out, turned to his partner, and spoke in a low, serious voice. There, he told him to secure the scene and call for backup. There was someone inside, and he could already tell they were deceased. About an hour later, at around 6 in the evening on the 27th of June, 2004, Detective Daniel Salado stopped his cruiser in front of a condo in Laguna Niguel, California. The call from dispatch hadn't given him much information, just that an older woman had been found dead in her home and that the circumstances were suspicious. When Salado got out of his car, he could see that the scene was already very active. There was yellow police tape stretched across the condo's front door and blocking off the driveway. Just inside that perimeter, he saw a uniformed officer speaking to two women who were crying and looked visibly distraught. Dozens of other officers and crime scene technicians were scattered around the property, beginning the slow, meticulous process of collecting evidence. One of the deputies saw Salado arrive and hurried over to give him an update. The deputy confirmed that the deceased woman had been identified as the owner of the condo, a 72-year-old, named Jane Thompson. And from the looks of it, it was not a natural death. It appeared she had been attacked. It looked like a murder. Her two friends, the two women who were still standing in the driveway talking to the police, had been the ones to call for a wellness check. The first responding officers had found Jane lying on the floor in her living room. They had been able to get inside through her sliding back door, the deputy explained, because the door was already open when they arrived. Salado glanced back over at the two crying women. He told the deputy to make sure they stuck around. After he took a look inside, he definitely wanted to speak to them. As the deputy hurried off to relay the message, Salado walked around to the back of the house. When he got there, he saw that not only was the sliding glass door open, but there were no obvious signs of a forced entry around the frame or the lock. That could mean a couple of things. Either it had been left unlocked, or maybe Jane had known her attacker and willingly let them into her home. Salado took a deep breath and stepped inside the condo. Right away, the scene was chaotic. Technicians were everywhere, dusting for prints, taking photographs, carefully documenting every detail. And what he saw was blood. There was blood spatter on the walls and on the furniture. And then, when he looked down at the floor, he saw Jane's body. She was lying face down, positioned between her couch and her coffee table. There was a large, dark pool of blood around her head. Salado crouched down next to her to get a better look. The wounds were brutal. Her head had been so badly pulverized that Salado could see parts of her skull, the actual bone, and he could see clear breaks in that bone. Her skull was shattered. Now, Salado knew he would have to wait for the official autopsy report to be sure, but to his experienced eye, it was very clear what had happened here. Somebody had taken some kind of heavy, blunt object and beaten this woman over and over and over again. A couple of minutes later, Salado stood back up. Based on the sheer extent of Jane's injuries, it seemed obvious to him that this was a frenzied, rage-filled attack. It was personal, and it had likely happened very, very quickly. Or maybe the attack happened in a way that Jane was completely caught off guard, because aside from the awful trauma to her head, she didn't appear to have any other wounds. There were no defensive injuries on her arms or hands. It didn't seem like she had tried to fight back or protect herself at all. And other than the blood spatter, the room around her showed no signs of a struggle. Nothing was overturned, nothing was broken. It was as if she was just standing or lying right here, and someone destroyed her, and the blood went everywhere. Salado left the living room and began to search the rest of her condo. He went into her bedroom, he searched her closets, he went through the small office, and he checked the kitchen. But there were no signs of anybody ransacking the place. There was no obvious theft that had taken place, at least not at first glance. He saw expensive electronics, a nice television, a stereo system, all still sitting out in the open. To Salado, at least right now, he was pretty sure this was not a simple robbery gone wrong. This felt different. As he was finishing his initial walkthrough of the condo, another officer called Salado back into the kitchen. When Salado went over, he saw the officer was standing by the landline phone's answering machine. The officer told Salado that there were a bunch of new, unplayed messages on it. He had checked the times, and the messages started on the morning of Friday, June 25th. Salado was immediately interested in that. It was a huge piece of information because it helped them start to build a timeline. If Jane had stopped answering her phone by Friday morning, then that meant she could have died sometime overnight on Thursday the 24th, or maybe even in the early morning hours before that first message came through on the 25th. At the very least, it gave them a window. Salado told the officer to be sure to log the tape from the machine into evidence. Then Salado went back to the living room where Jane's body was and where the technicians were still working. He just stood there for a moment, his arms crossed, thinking about his next move. Considering the attack had all the signs of being highly emotional, Salado felt confident that Jane's killer was someone who knew her, someone who was deeply, personally angry with her. So, the first people he needed to speak to were those who were closest to Jane, people like her family, her friends, or maybe even a romantic partner. Jane appeared to live alone, so he hoped that other people in the neighborhood, or maybe those two women who called the police, could tell him more about her personal life, her relationships, and give him a solid place to start his investigation. So Salado gathered a few officers, and they all headed outside to begin asking some questions. When he got back outside, Salado could see that a small crowd had formed. A group of what he assumed were residents of the complex were gathered at the edge of the police perimeter, watching the activity with concerned looks on their faces. Salado understood why. Brutal homicides like this one almost never happened in a quiet area like Laguna Niguel. He knew there was probably going to be a lot of panic and a lot of rumors spreading through this tight-knit community because of this. And based on the literal layout of the complex, the fact that all these condos were practically on top of each other, he knew that those rumors would likely spread very, very quickly. But there was a potential upside to that. The fact that these condos were so tightly packed together also gave Salado an advantage. It meant that it was very likely that somebody might have heard something or seen something that could help them break this case wide open. Just then, another police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, and a detective named Brian Sutton stepped out of the car. When Salado saw who it was, he immediately felt a sense of relief. Salado worked extremely well with Detective Sutton. They were a good team, and conducting interviews was their specialty. As a duo, they just had an instinct for asking the right questions, the kinds of questions that got people talking and opening up. So, Salado hurried over to Sutton and quickly brought him up to speed on everything he had learned so far. Once Sutton was briefed, they went right over to the two women who had called 911. Salado was eager to interview them as key witnesses. But he also wasn't ruling out the idea that they could be suspects. He was sure this had to be a personal crime, and these two women clearly had some kind of close relationship with Jane, since they were the ones who had come over to check on her. When Salado and Sutton reached the women, he could tell they had calmed down quite a bit from when he had first seen them. They were still upset, but they were composed enough to tell the detectives their names, Mary and Karen. They then explained that they were good friends with Jane and that they had come over to check on her because Mary had gotten a worried phone call from Jane's girlfriend, a woman named Marion Reese, who lived in L.A. They said Marion had been worried because Jane had not shown up in L.A. for plans they had, and so she was trying to find out where she was and if she was okay. This immediately made Salado's ears perk up. A girlfriend. He asked Mary for Marion's contact information. As he jotted down Marion's phone number, Sutton asked the two women where they were on the night of Thursday the 24th or the early morning of the 25th. Both women said they had solid alibis. Now, the detectives would still have to confirm those alibis, because anybody can say they have one. But for right now, Salado was comfortable provisionally ruling Mary and Karen out as suspects. They both seemed genuinely stunned and horrified by Jane's murder. And while it seemed like they were good friends with Jane, he wasn't getting the sense that they had the kind of intense, complicated closeness that might have led to such a vicious and personal attack. So he told the two women they were free to go home. Then Salado nodded to Sutton, and the two of them left the women and headed towards the crowd of neighbors to ask some more questions. The next morning, on Monday, June 28th, Salado was behind the wheel of his cruiser with Sutton in the passenger seat. They were nearing the end of their long drive up to Los Angeles. Their destination was the home of Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese. Salado was eager to get her statement because, at this point, they didn't have many other leads to go on. The forensics team hadn't found any usable DNA or fingerprints at the crime scene that could be tested against future suspects. And the canvas of Jane's condo complex the night before really hadn't yielded much either. They had learned that no one had seen Jane since Thursday, which backed up the timeline they had already established from the answering machine messages. But frustratingly, none of the neighbors had heard or seen anything strange or out of the ordinary on that Thursday night. And according to everyone they spoke to, Jane didn't have any obvious feuds or tension with anybody in the community. She generally kept to herself, but she was really well liked by everyone who knew her. But Salado, remembering the scene he had just witnessed, felt sure that someone out there had to have had a major problem with Jane. He had seen the preliminary autopsy report that morning, and it confirmed what he already suspected. Jane had died from the blunt force trauma wounds to her head. But it also told him something else. She had been hit more than a dozen times. It was complete and total overkill. And to Soledo, that meant the killer had to have been driven by some kind of intense, overwhelming emotion, like pure rage or maybe even greed. Which was why they were now making this drive out to LA. They were going to speak with Marion, who Soledo felt, based on her intimate relationship with Jane, was the strongest suspect they had. Romance, he knew, could make people do crazy things. And there was something else. Soledo had done some digging into Jane's finances the night before, and he found out that she had a life insurance policy worth $100,000. And Marion Reese was listed as the sole beneficiary. That meant Marion definitely had something to gain financially from Jane's death. So, as they pulled up to Marion's house, Soledo was thinking that maybe, just maybe, they had found their killer. A few minutes later, the detectives sat on a couch in Marion Reese's living room. The home was on the smaller side, especially by LA standards, but it was very tastefully decorated. Marion sat down in an armchair across from them. When they looked at her, they could see her eyes were red and puffy, as if she had been crying for hours. She was holding a glass of water in her hand, and she kept lifting it up as if she was going to take a sip, but then she would just place it back down on the end table without drinking. It was like she was in a daze, just going through the motions. It was clear that someone, likely Mary or Karen, had already told Marion about Jane's death. And to Soledo, she was showing every sign of being in genuine, profound shock. He knew he had to be very careful with his line of questioning. He didn't want to overwhelm her. If she shut down completely, he might not get the information he so desperately needed. After a moment of silence, Soledo began by simply asking Marion how she knew Jane. Marion took a deep, shaky breath, and then, with a wavering voice, she explained that they had known each other for almost 50 years. She told them how they used to work together, how Jane had produced so many projects for her production company. As Marion continued to talk, describing how their professional relationship had slowly transitioned into a deep and loving romance, Soledo could sense that she was beginning to calm down a little. She was calming down to the point where he felt like he could now introduce the tougher questions. So he turned and gave a slight nod to Sutton. At that point, Sutton leaned forward and asked Marion if she was aware that Jane had named her as the sole beneficiary on her life insurance policy. When Marion heard the question, she gasped. She looked completely taken aback. She insisted she had no idea Jane had done that. But, she added, it did sort of make sense. She explained that Jane really didn't have any family to speak of, and that in many ways she, Marion, was her family. She was the closest relationship Jane had in the world. Now, Soledo felt like Marion's reaction to this news was very earnest, very genuine, but he couldn't be 100% sure. So he pressed her a little more. He asked her where she was last Thursday night, the night they presumed Jane was killed. But Marion didn't hesitate. She said she was with friends all night right there in LA. And she gave Soledo all the names and phone numbers of these friends so he and his partner could confirm her story. They talked for a while longer. Marion went over the details of how Jane had missed their opera date on Friday, and then how she had stopped returning her frantic calls. Her entire story lined up perfectly with what Jane's friend Mary had already told them. So eventually, Soledo and Sutton thanked her for her time and stood up to leave. Over an hour later, Detectives Soledo and Sutton were back in Laguna Niguel, parking their cruiser in front of Jane's condo once again. On their drive back from Marion's house in LA, the detectives had made some calls. They had spoken to several of Marion's friends, the ones she had given them the numbers for, and every single one of them confirmed her alibi. On the night Jane was killed, Marion was with them and she was in Los Angeles. And so now, Soledo had to admit that Marion was looking less and less like a viable suspect. So the detectives were back at Jane's condo to look into another working theory they had about what might have happened here. They were considering the possibility that Jane's murder was a hate crime. Remember, this was back in 2004, a time when being homosexual was not as widely accepted as it is today. And so their theory was that maybe one of Jane's neighbors had seen Marion visiting, or perhaps had heard about their relationship through the grapevine. And maybe they didn't like it. And maybe they had lashed out in a fit of violent prejudice. Strengthening this idea was the fact that it seemed to be common knowledge in the neighborhood that most people left their doors unlocked. It painted a picture of a community that was perhaps too trusting, making it easy for a neighbor with a grudge to slip inside Jane's home. However, Sutton and Salado both knew that actually investigating this theory was going to be extremely challenging. There were 144 houses in this condo complex. Conducting a thorough investigation of every single resident of all of those houses was going to be a monumental task that would take a lot of time and manpower. But at this point, they didn't have any other options. They had to pursue every possible lead. So, the detectives got to work. They went to the first house next to Jane's and knocked on the door. A few hours later, Salado and Sutton returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Department. They had spent most of the afternoon talking to people who lived in Jane's condo complex. And while they hadn't been able to talk to everyone yet, they already had to admit that their hate crime theory was looking more and more like a dead end. Most of the people they spoke to didn't even know Jane was in a relationship at all. Since her girlfriend Marion lived in a different city, they rarely saw her around. And beyond that, there was just nothing that anyone in the neighborhood said that made the detectives think that Jane was being targeted for any particular reason. But a few people had mentioned something interesting. They said that recently there had been a string of burglaries in the complex. This was something that was completely unheard of in a safe, quiet place like Laguna Niguel. Still, there was a huge difference between somebody breaking into a house to steal some stuff and breaking in and bludgeoning someone to death with such brutality. But it was a lead, a new thread to pull on. And that's what Salado was thinking about as he and Sutton walked towards their desks. But before they even got there, Salado had this sudden flash of insight, an epiphany. He just stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of the squad room. He turned to Sutton and said, "Turn around. We have to go back to the evidence room. I think everything we need to solve this case might be in this building with us right now." The following day, Salado and Sutton pulled up in front of a restaurant called the Beach House. The previous afternoon, after his epiphany, Salado had suggested that he and Sutton go back to the evidence room and listen to the tapes from Jane's answering machine one more time. Now, to be clear, they had already listened to the tapes before. But at the time, none of the messages had seemed particularly important or relevant. But now, based on what they had learned over the course of their investigation, they realized that those seemingly insignificant messages might actually tell them a lot. And so Salado and Sutton had spent hours re-listening to the tapes, transcribing them, and then gathering even more evidence to confirm what was on them. And even though they were now pretty sure that all this evidence they were gathering told them exactly who killed Jane, they still needed one more piece to fall into place. They had a book of photographs with them. It was a photo lineup. And they knew for a fact that one of the photographs in that book was of their killer. They just needed somebody in this restaurant to verify it for them. So, as soon as they got inside, they found the manager and explained why they were there. Then they asked him, "Hey, would you mind looking at these photos for us? See if you recognize anyone?" The manager looked a bit alarmed by the request, but he ultimately agreed to help. So they all went into a back room away from the customers. They opened up their book of photos and laid it on a table. The manager leaned over and looked. And almost immediately his finger shot out and he pointed to one of the pictures. And when Salado saw the person the manager was pointing to, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He knew they had finally cracked the case. Based on forensic evidence and eventually a full confession, here is what investigators believe happened to Jane Thompson in the early morning hours of the 25th of June, 2004. The killer, dressed in dark clothes and gloves and holding a hammer, stood in the darkness of Jane's backyard, right outside her sliding glass doors. The killer had already been to Jane's house a few times earlier that night. But each time they had approached, they had ultimately lost their nerve and left. Because every time they would get there, they would peek through the glass door and see Jane asleep on the couch in front of the television. And that was a problem. They needed Jane to leave the room. They needed her to go to her bedroom and go to sleep in there, out of the way. But she wasn't moving. But this time, as they stood outside the glass doors, they knew they had to go in. They knew if they didn't do it now, they would never get what they wanted from Jane, even if she was right there on the couch. So, the killer took a deep breath, reached forward, and tried the handle of the back door. It slid right open, just as they had expected. It was unlocked. Once the door was open, the killer stepped inside, very carefully, very quietly, and made their way over to the couch where Jane was sleeping. They just wanted to check to make absolutely sure that she was still asleep. But as the killer was hovering over Jane, looking down at her as she lay on her back on the couch, the unthinkable happened. Jane's eyes opened, and she looked right at them. The killer was so surprised, so utterly terrified of being caught, that they instinctively lifted the hammer they were holding and brought it down on Jane's head with all their strength. When the killer finally stopped and their adrenaline-fueled panic began to subside, they just stared down at Jane's destroyed body in total, numb shock. Then they backed away, and they realized that the hammer, the murder weapon, was dripping blood everywhere. So they grabbed the head of the hammer with their gloved hand to try and stop it from dripping, and then they turned and ran right back out through the sliding door. The killer hurried across the street in the darkness, and as they went, they tossed the hammer into a nearby trash can. And when they finally got to their own home, just steps away, they stripped off their bloody clothes, balled them up, and then tried to decide where to hide them. And as they stood there, trying to figure out what to do, they looked out their bedroom window at the house across the street, the house where they had just killed the one person in their life who had ever given them a second chance. It would turn out that Jane Thompson was murdered by a child. Her 5-year-old neighbor, Sam Nelson. Sam had actually broken into Jane's house more than once. He had been breaking in repeatedly and stealing all sorts of things from her, including her credit cards. And that was what the messages on her answering machine had been about. Jane's credit card company had been calling her back after she had reported a series of fraudulent charges on her account. And one of those charges was from that seafood restaurant, the Beach House, the one the investigators visited with the photo lineup. And the manager, when he looked at the photos, he instantly recognized Sam. Because Sam had been in there just a few days earlier, acting so frantic and strange, the reason Sam was stealing from Jane, and also from other people in the neighborhood, was ultimately because he was trying to keep up with appearances. He was using the stolen credit cards and money to buy food and expensive items that he thought would impress his wealthy classmates. On the night of Jane's murder, Sam claimed he did not go into her house with the intention of killing her. He said he just went in there with the intention of robbing her again. But for whatever reason, when she opened her eyes and saw him standing over her, he just panicked. He hit her once with the hammer. He said the blood went into his mouth, and his mind just went blank. And then, suddenly, he was beating her to death. Sam Nelson was arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for the murder of Jane Thompson and also for multiple counts of burglary. His earliest eligible parole date is in the year 2027. He will be in his late 30s. Jane's friends and her partner, Marion, were left to grapple with an impossible reality. The kind, forgiving woman they loved had been murdered by a boy she was trying to help, a boy from the very community she had chosen for its safety and warmth. The unlocked doors of Laguna Niguel, once a symbol of trust, now served as a haunting reminder of how quickly a life can be shattered by a darkness hiding in plain sight. Thank you so much for watching. Jane spent her final days believing she had done the right thing by giving a troubled kid a second chance. And maybe that's the cruelest part of this entire story. Her kindness was real. Let me know what you thought about today's episode in the comments. And if you're ready for another true crime story, we have a full playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, take care. On the morning of the 16th of May, 2006, at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, A woman called Allison Rivera, who was 35 years old, abruptly repositioned herself in her bed. She was at her residence in Baltimore, Maryland, and the alarm for the house security system was going off on high volume. Now, despite the fact that that information was shocking, she was not entirely taken aback by it. The explanation for this is that the alarm had actually sounded at a time that was practically identical to the time it had sounded the night before. Despite the fact that the bedroom was completely black, Allison was able to make out the silhouette of her husband, Ray, as he climbed out of bed and immediately grabbed a baseball bat. Immediately after that, he hurriedly exited the room and made his way down the stairs. As soon as she stood up, Allison followed closely behind him. They turned on the lights and had a look around as they reached the bottom of the steps, in spite of the fact that the alarm was still blaring. It appeared to Allison that there was no one inside their home. All of the doors were closed and secured firmly. However, as she turned her attention to a certain window, she noticed that it was slightly open, albeit just a very small amount. Again, this was hardly a complete and utter surprise. The previous evening, when the alarm had sounded, they had contacted the authorities to report the incident. The authorities had arrived and examined the location. However, despite the fact that they did not find anyone, they did find that this particular window had been tampered with. For some reason, it appeared as though someone had attempted to force it open, which is what triggered the alarm. At this point, it appeared as though it had occurred once more. However, on that initial night, the police did not believe that it was a real attempt to break into the building. Allison and Ray had been informed by them that the alarm was most likely an alarm that was set off by a squirrel. It's a squirrel. At the time, Allison and Ray thought that was a little bit crazy, but the cops looked pretty convinced about it, and it was a logical enough explanation, so they had just accepted it when they heard it. They went back to bed after making sure the window was shut, turning off the alarm, and then going back to bed. On the other hand, here they were, 24 hours later, standing in the same position. The alarm was going off once more, and that window was obviously up once more. The concept that a squirrel would be doing this 2 nights in a row at the same time seemed very implausible to me. Something didn't feel quite right. Both Allison and Ray couldn't help but have the feeling that the authorities could have been mistaken. It's possible that this wasn't a squirrel. Presumably, this was an individual who was attempting to enter their residence. In point of fact, Allison had this nagging anxiety in the back of her mind about what might be going on, and she simply couldn't seem to shake it. She was concerned that her husband, Ray, may be the target of an assassination attempt. It is important to note that Ray and Allison had just recently relocated to Baltimore. It was because Ray had been offered a position at Stansbury and Associates, a financial investing firm located in the city, that they decided to relocate. One of Ray's special responsibilities was to compose the email newsletter for the company. Through this newsletter, subscribers were provided with guidance on purchasing and selling stocks. But here was the issue that arose. Actually, Ray had no idea what she was doing when it came to investing. The only thing he had experience with was screenwriting and freelance videography. He had no background in money. The only reason he had even the slightest chance of getting this position was because the company was owned by one of his close friends, and that buddy had hired him as a favor. In light of this, it is fair to say that some of the financial guidance that Ray was offering in this newsletter was, to put it bluntly, bad, despite the fact that he was doing his best. And it was highly probable that a great deal of money had been lost by individuals as a result of it. As a result, Allison had the impression that it was feasible for one of these irate and dissatisfied subscribers to have discovered their address and was now attempting to exact revenge on Ray. However, despite this, that was a very bizarre and conspiratorial theory. Consequently, on this particular evening, when the alarm went off for the second time, Allison did not share any of her concerns with Ray. She simply strolled over and switched off the alarm system instead of doing anything else. During the time that she was doing that, Ray went through the entire house, carefully inspecting each and every room. After that, he proceeded to check that the window was closed as securely as it could be. After then, Allison inquired of Ray whether or not they ought to make another attempt to contact the authorities. On the other hand, Ray just declined. As the police had stated, he informed her that it was quite probable that it was only a squirrel once more. He gave her the assurance that the house was secure and that they were no longer in danger. He suggested that they should sleep for a while longer. So, despite the fact that Allison was experiencing a great deal of unease with the entire situation, she accepted. Both of them then returned to the upper floor and went back to their respective beds. Allison sat down at the table in their dining room early the following morning, and she started eating the meal that Ray had prepared for her in a hurry. She was about to embark on a trip for professional reasons. The journey to Virginia would take her 3 hours, and she needed to be on the road as soon as possible. Consequently, once she had finished her meal, she disposed of her plate in the sink, and Ray took her suitcase to her vehicle without her having to struggle. I love yous were spoken between them as they stood by the car for a few period. After that, Allison got in the car and drove away, waving to Ray as she drove away from the home when she left. After waiting for 3 hours, Allison finally arrived in Virginia. The entire day was spent working, and she eventually checked into her hotel at approximately 6:30 the evening. She had been working the entire day. When she reached this stage, Allison was so worn out that she was on the verge of collapsing onto the bed of the motel. She only desired to make a phone call to Ray in order to check in, then perhaps watch a little bit of television before retiring for the night. Following that, she pulled out her phone and dialed his number. There were a couple rings on the phone, but after that, it simply went to his voicemail every time. That was weird, to say the least. It took her a few minutes to wait before she attempted to call once more. Nevertheless, the same thing took place. Repeatedly, it rang, and then it went to the voicemail section. This was indeed a unique occurrence. In a normal situation, Ray would always answer his phone, and he was surely anticipating a call from her about this time to let him know that she had arrived safely and checked in. However, Allison suddenly recalled something that helped her feel a little bit better about the situation. A woman by the name of Claudia, who was one of her coworkers, was actually staying with them at their home in Baltimore where they were staying. Due to the fact that Claudia was merely passing through the region and in need of a place to spend the night, she was present beside Ray. Allison made the decision to give Claudia a call. Immediately, Claudia picked up the phone. When Allison inquired as to whether or not Ray was present, Claudia responded with a statement that was somewhat unexpected. It was a couple of hours earlier, so around between 5 and 6 o'clock in the evening, she stated that Ray had been arriving at the residence. While Claudia was staying in the guest room, he was working on his computer in his office, which was located down the hall from its location. Claudia reported that she heard Ray's mobile phone ringing when she was in the guest room. Just a few seconds into the discussion, she heard him remark, "Oh shit." After that, Ray allegedly ran out of the house in a literal sense, as stated by Claudia. He picked up the phone and began talking to her. She heard him get into his car, and then she heard the car drive away from their area. She was able to pinpoint the exact moment when the automobile left. In her conversation with Allison, Claudia revealed that she was clueless about his whereabouts and that he had not yet returned. It is clear that Allison was perplexed when she heard all of this, but she did not immediately become anxious about the situation. She reasoned that whatever it was that had caused Ray to hurry out of the house in such a manner was most likely some type of emergency that occurred at work or even with his friends or family. Despite the fact that it might be a terrible thing, she presumed that Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he had the opportunity to do so. Allison expressed her gratitude to Claudia while making an effort to avoid appearing anxious. Once she had finished speaking, she hung up the phone and began getting ready for bed. And while she was getting dressed, she had her phone right next to her, monitoring it, and waiting for the call from Ray that she was certain would arrive any moment now. She was certain that the call arrived at any moment. Allison was awakened the following morning at 5:30 a.m. by the sound of her phone ringing through her ears. An instantaneous surge of optimism swept over her. The fact that she eventually called to explain what was going on led her to believe that it was Ray. However, when she looked at the screen of her phone, she discovered that Claudia had called her once more. In spite of this, she pondered, well, maybe Claudia is with Ray at this very moment. She may be calling to let me know that everything is great and that she will explain everything to me. Perhaps she has some new information to share with me. Therefore, Allison answered the phone and asked Claudia, "Hey, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" Claudia responded by saying, "Your husband has not yet returned home. I have no idea what is going on with him, but I have to leave now. I have to go to the airport." Allison then continued to ask Claudia about her husband. Having reached this stage, Allison was no longer able to conceal the fear that was in her voice. It was impossible for her to contain her anxiety. As for Ray, what exactly was going on? That he would stay out all night, that he would ignore all of her calls, and that he would still not be home was utterly different from his usual behavior. What was going on was completely unknown to her. Claudia appeared to be aware of her anxiety and was in the process of requesting whether or not she should remain and wait for Ray to return home. However, Allison informed her, "No, go ahead, go to the airport, do what you need to do. I'm going to cancel my work trip. I'm coming home right now. I have to figure out what's going on with Ray." Soon after Allison finished her phone call, she hurled all of her belongings back into her luggage and walked away. She left the hotel and started the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore after she had checked out of the hotel. To the best of her ability, she managed to maintain her composure while driving. However, she was contacting Ray's mobile phone for the majority of the time, and she did so repeatedly. And he never spoke back to me. As time went on, she eventually reached a point where the phone would no longer ring when she called. If he answered, it would immediately be sent to his voicemail. This indicated that his phone had been turned off at this point, or alternatively, the battery may have died. And it was at that moment that Allison was unable to maintain control of her panic disorder any longer. She was aware on a fundamental level that there was a significant problem. She had a hypothesis that it was connected to the job that her husband was doing at the time. She was unable to provide any evidence to support her claim, but she had the impression that something terrible had taken place. The remainder of that lengthy drive was spent by Allison making frantic phone calls to each and everyone she could think of. She made a phone call to Ray's place of employment. All of his pals were contacted by her. He was contacted by members of his family. She questioned each and every person to determine whether or not they had received a message from him, or whether or not they had called him the previous evening and said something that could have frightened him. In every case. She spoke to a number of people, but they all stated the same thing. They were unable to locate or communicate with Ray. After what seemed like an eternity, Allison was finally able to turn onto her neighborhood, and she felt a glimmer of hope. When she arrived at her home, she was hoping that Ray's car would be parked in the driveway, that Ray would be inside, and that he would have some strange narrative that would explain everything that had happened. Not at all. When she arrived, his automobile was nowhere to be found. No one was inside the house. Additionally, she was quite positive, with a surety that shook her to her very core, that there was unquestionably something wrong. As a result, she made a complete about-face, got back into her vehicle, and proceeded to drive straight to the police station. Nevertheless, when Allison went to the police and reported that her husband was missing, it became almost immediately apparent to her that the authorities were not actually that concerned about the situation. They believed that Ray was an adult who had left the house of his own free will. This was their interpretation of the situation. On top of that, he hadn't even been absent for a complete 24 hours yet. Allison's report was taken down by the police, and they did, in fact, tell her that they would look for him, but she had the impression that they were not quite as concerned as she was. On the other hand, the friends and family of Allison and Ray were undoubtedly concerned. As the days progressed, they all made their way to Baltimore in order to show their support for Allison and to assist in the search for Ray. In their search for him or his vehicle, they traveled all over the city, but they were unable to find any trace of him or his vehicle anywhere they went. They made a call to all of the local hospitals and inquired about any John Does who could have been brought in, but none of the descriptions that were provided fit Ray. They also reviewed Ray's bank records, but they found that he had not used any of his credit or debit cards since he had vanished. Moreover, as the days went by, Allison continued to feel more and more hopeless because she had not received any fresh information or any updates from the authorities. After what seemed like an eternity, Ray finally began searching through her own home one afternoon, a few days after she had went missing for the first time. She was searching for any hint, any clue at all, that might provide her with information about where Ray had gone. After some time had passed, she made her way into the office where Ray had been working on his computer when Claudia had heard him yell and run out of the home. And there, on Ray's desk, she discovered something peculiar. This was in that room. I was looking at a piece of paper that had been folded up into a very, very small size. It had been taped to the back of his computer monitor, and it was wrapped in a piece of plastic before being attached to it. As a result, Allison gently pulled off the tape, opened up the container, and unfolded the paper using the appropriate technique. What she discovered was a letter that had been typed. The actual contents of the letter made absolutely no sense at all, despite the fact that it was addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. In it, there was a mention to a secret club that was referred to as the Council. It discussed secrets and a game of some kind. Additionally, it included 3 different listings. Technologies such as Bluetooth and Wi-Fi were included on one of the lists. There was another list that contained a collection of movie titles that appeared to be utterly arbitrary. Not only did the third list contain the names of genuine people, but it also contained the names of famous people and members of Ray's own family and friends. Now, if a random person were to look at this note, they would probably have thought that it was very disjointed about itself. One could even consider it to be a probable sign of a severe mental disorder of some type. To Allison, however, it did not appear to be written in that manner. She was aware of the fact that Ray had a particular fascination with conspiracies and hidden societies, but she did it from a creative perspective. When she initially read it, she experienced a brief moment of perplexity. However, she eventually came to the conclusion that perhaps this paper was simply him gathering ideas for a new script that he was working on. In the event that he was attempting to create a script on this thing that was referred to as the Council, whatever that was, she would not have been surprised in the least. The manner in which the letter was printed, folded up to such a small size, and then taped to the back of the computer was something that brought Allison a great deal of astonishment. Simply put, it appeared to be so strange and so covert. When Allison arrived at the police station, she took the note with her and gave it to the officer who was in charge of Ray's case. It was received as evidence by the police, who also informed her that they would be in touch with her regarding the matter. However, they did not communicate with one another. However, despite the passage of several days, Ray did not appear and the authorities did not provide any new information. And as a result, Allison was completely at a loss for what else to do. However, on May 22nd, which is 6 days after Ray vanished, Allison received a phone call from her parents. At the time, she was at home listening to the news. They informed her that they had been searching the city for Ray and that they had discovered something when they were operating their vehicle. A few minutes later, Allison's vehicle slid into a parking lot in the central business district of Baltimore. She parked her vehicle in close proximity to the vehicle that belonged to her parents. The entire region was teeming with law enforcement personnel and people driving news vans. Allison had the ability to see what everyone else was looking at despite the hectic swarm of people that she was surrounded by. This was Ray's vehicle. As a result, Allison stepped out of her vehicle and ran to the nearest police officer, where she inquired about the situation's current state of affairs. After her parents had seen Ray's car, they informed her that they had reached out to the authorities to report the incident. Due to the fact that officers had arrived to conduct an investigation, they saw that Ray's vehicle had a parking ticket displayed on the windshield. It was evident from the ticket that the vehicle had been parked in this lot for a period of 6 days. Therefore, it had been present since the evening of the 16th of May. Since the same night that Ray had vanished, this indicated that his vehicle had been here in this particular lot right here in this very location. Ray's personal items, such as his phone and his money clip, were not found inside the vehicle, according to the officer who informed her of this fact. In addition, there was no evidence of a break-in, thus it did not appear as though they had been taken from the vehicle. Therefore, it seemed as though on the night that Ray vanished, he had driven here, parked in this lot, and gotten out of his vehicle. This was the initial impression that was given. However, following that, nobody was aware of what had transpired with him. Allison's terror and panic reached a whole new level the moment she made this revelation. Furthermore, it appeared to make both the authorities and the general public regard the disappearance of Ray with a great deal more seriousness. Suddenly, it seemed as though people from all across the city were searching for Ray throughout the entire city. A volunteer search group made the decision to go up onto the roof of a downtown parking garage on May 24th, which was now 8 days after Ray had been reported missing. This was 2 days after the initial report of her disappearance. In order to assist them in their quest for Ray, they desired to have a more comprehensive perspective of the city. When they reached the top of the mountain, they witnessed something that, if it had anything to do with Ray, was extremely, really dark. Because of this, they quickly dialed the police number. A historic structure known as the Belvedere was located just next to this parking garage. It was once a luxurious hotel, but it has since been converted into a condominium complex. At the point where it reached its tallest position, the main part of the Belvedere was 13 floors vertical. But in addition to that, it was connected to a smaller piece that was still a part of the building, and this section was just 2 stories tall. They were able to see the main Belvedere building from the top of the parking garage where the search team was located. However, if they looked down, they could also see the roof of the smaller 2-story section of the structure. And while they were on that roof, they noticed 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a mobile phone, and a hole in the roof that was quite evident. A detective by the name of Michael Bayer and a group of Baltimore police officers were following a concierge down a hallway within the Belvedere building during the span of an hour. When Detective Bayer and his crew had initially arrived, they had spoken with the workers of the building about a hole that was located in the roof of that 2-story part. On the other hand, none of them had any idea what the police were explaining. An explanation was provided by the staff members that the section of the structure that appeared to have the hole was in fact closed off and had been for a considerable amount of time. It would appear that nobody, or at least not any member of the staff, had visited that particular location in the recent past. As a result, they were unable to determine whether or not there was a hole in that area. Nobody knew for sure, but there was a possibility. To add insult to injury, not a single member of the staff or resident had reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary in the past week and a half. As a result, there was no evidence to suggest that any injury had been sustained anywhere within the structure. However, at this point, the concierge was directing Detective Bayer and his team around a number of meandering hallways and through a number of locked doors until they eventually arrived at the room that corresponded to the location of the hole in the roof. Additionally, as soon as the door to that room was unlocked by the concierge, Detective Bayer and his crew were confronted with a foul odor. Once inside, they went. One could tell that it had been a conference room in the past because it was a very large room that was completely empty. Ray Rivera's body was illuminated by the light that was coming down from the hole in the ceiling. The light was shining right on her. Around Ray, who was laying on the floor with her face up, dried blood was all around her. He had a mutilated body there. Because of the severity of the break, the bones of one of his legs were protruding at strange angles. In addition to this, he had fallen into a state of extreme decomposition, which was definitely the cause of the foul odor. Initially, Detective Bayer was examining the body of Ray. He then turned his attention to the hole in the roof, and he said to himself, okay, it is obvious that Ray fell through the roof and landed here. Using that method, he was able to enter this locked room. The roof was broken by his entrance. However, after conducting a more thorough examination of the hole, as well as the items that the search party had observed on the roof, such as the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then later on, when they performed an autopsy on Ray's body, they came to the conclusion that it was physically impossible for Ray to have entered this room through the hole. This is due to the fact that there were only 3 conceivable locations on the roof of the Belvedere from which Ray might have dropped or jumped in order to arrive at that particular location with her landing. In addition, when you compared them to the evidence that the police had, none of them made any sense at all. There was a potential that Ray had either fallen or jumped from the very top of the main Belvedere building, which is 13 floors tall. This was the initial scenario. His shattered legs, broken skull, and broken ribs were among the catastrophic injuries that were discovered during the autopsy. It is certain that he would have died as a result of a fall from that height, which would have also caused the injuries that were discovered. The hole in the roof of the second story was located 45 feet away from the edge of the roof of the 13th story, which was located from the horizontal. From a physics perspective, it was practically impossible that Ray could have somehow gotten a running start, leaped off the roof as hard as he could, and carried himself 45 feet forward before plunging down and hitting the roof. A person would not be able to jump that far, because it is simply too far away. The second hypothesis was that Ray had possibly fallen out of a decorative ledge that could be found on the 11th level of the Belvedere. This ledge was thin and looped around the exterior of the building. It is possible that Ray would have landed in the location where the hole was if he had fallen from that height. On the other hand, it was not possible to reach that ledge without first passing through a condo or office that was privately owned and located on that floor. In order for Ray to enter one of those secret areas, she would have needed to be physically allowed to do so. On the other hand, no one in any part of the building had reported seeing him or having any kind of confrontation with him. There was also the possibility that Ray had jumped off the top of the parking garage where the search team had been present. This was the third scenario. The distance between them was close enough horizontally that if he had jumped, he would have been able to land in the same location as the hole. However, the very highest point of that parking garage was just around 20 feet over the roof of the Belvedere, which was located on the second floor. Even if a fall of 20 feet is definitely high enough to do substantial harm to your body, it is not a fall that is high enough to cause the severe injuries that were discovered on Ray's body. It was simply not a drop that was long enough. And then, to make this whole situation even stranger, when the police examined those items that were found on the roof next to the hole, they discovered that all of the items were not scattered around, as if he had blasted through the roof and everything had just flown off of him. This was the case with Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and his cell phone. On the contrary, they appeared to be arranged in a manner that was somewhat planned, and were arranged in a nice manner on the roof, almost as if they had been set there on purpose. Additionally, neither Ray's spectacles nor his phone were in any way harmed in the incident. Therefore, it was only natural to wonder how something like this could have taken place. Simply put, what caused him to collapse in the first place? And even if you were able to determine the source of his fall, you would still be unable to explain how his personal items were able to be arranged so neatly on the roof without being damaged in any way. It simply did not make any sense at all. And as a result, the authorities were at a loss for what to make of all of this. Consequently, they refocused their attention on a completely new piece of evidence, which was the peculiar note that Allison had discovered affixed to the back of Ray's computer in their residence. In the hope that it would provide them with some information, they forwarded that memo to the FBI for examination. It did, in fact. When the FBI returned, they stated that based on the message, it was highly likely that Ray was suffering from mental illness and was going through some kind of psychotic episode at the time that he wrote it. Their statement was that this was not a screenplay. The fact that he was experiencing this was evidence that something was severely wrong in his head. It was a bit of a comfort for the police, even though this did not completely explain all of the questions that they had. It appeared to provide a general explanation of a scenario that was extremely convoluted and hard to understand. In essence, this was sufficient for the Baltimore Police Department to cease their investigation, despite the fact that they did not officially conclude the case. And they informed Ray's wife Allison and her family that Ray's death, as strange as it was, and even though they didn't really know how it happened, they did know that it was most likely a suicide. They also reported that they knew that Ray had committed himself. Allison, on the other hand, was not at all content with this specific answer. To begin, it did not provide an explanation to the fundamental question of where Ray had fallen from. That appeared to be a situation that needed to be resolved as soon as possible. Irrespective of the fact that she was totally certain that Ray had not committed suicide, she did not believe that he suffered from any form of mental illness. In Allison's perspective, her husband was murdered, and it was quite likely that his job was the reason for his death. In this very moment, he was acting as if he were some kind of investment genius, and he was sending out these tips into that email that she and he both knew were, in essence, fake. The subject of investing was completely foreign to him. There was a possibility that the subscribers might be taken advantage of in a significant way. Many people were following his recommendations, and as a result, they might be losing a significant amount of money. Consequently, it appeared to her that it was not out of the question that someone who was upset with him for the poor advice he had given had gone after him. Furthermore, in addition to the notion that this was not an act of self-harm, there was that peculiar phone call, which added to the notion that something negative had occurred to Ray from an external source. When he shouted, "Oh shit," and then raced out of the home, Claudia, their acquaintance, had overheard him speak on the phone. Claudia had overheard him take the call. Specifically, the police were able to track down the call in question. Stansbury and Associates, the investment business to which Ray was employed, was the source of the information. No matter how hard they tried, they were never able to determine who had phoned him or why they had called him in the first place. As soon as the investigators started asking questions at the company, Stansbury and Associates engaged attorneys and instructed all of its employees to keep quiet about what had occurred, not even to the police. This was done because the company wanted to protect its reputation. This is the reason why the case of Ray Rivera has not been formally solved until this day. On the other hand, the individual who made that last phone call to Ray is still missing somewhere in the world. When Ray hurried out of his house in a panic that night, this individual must know the reason why he did so. And they might even know who was responsible for his death or how he passed away. However, as of this moment, that individual has not stepped forward. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?